in the series of announcements for anyone interested in Syria, I very much recommend tomorrow at SOAS 5 to 7 p.m. if you can make it at that time. There is the Syrian woman writer Samar Yazbek, the author of The Crossing, which is among other books, but The Crossing is one of the best books written about the present situation in Syria. And she will be reading from her book and discussing it tomorrow at 5 p.m. at SOAS. So, if you're interested in the topic, and in literature, and in Syria and all that, so I recommend this meeting. About the topic, as you is no, it's not here.
What prospects for peace?
Yeah, the prospects for peace in Syria. One should maybe start by saying that the short answer is very, very, very little prospects for peace at the present time. There is absolutely no factor, nothing that shows that we are anywhere on the road, on the way to peace today in Syria. The last kind of hope created on this issue was a few weeks ago when you had this ceasefire agreement, which actually was completely flawed from the start. It was obvious that it was a very flawed agreement. And one more time, one in which, although this might sound unusual, but I mean the United States was, or the Obama administration, I should say, and John Kerry were acting as if they were naive and getting into an agreement that was obviously to Russia's, in Russia's interest, and doomed to fail. And I mean, a number of people said, as soon as it was announced that it was doomed to fail, I for one, but there were many others, and indeed, as we saw, it collapsed very quickly. Now to understand the present situation, we have maybe to spend a little time to sketch what has been happening since the beginning of the uprising in Syria, because at the beginning there was an uprising there, as in other countries of the region. The Syrian uprising was no exception from that angle, and I should even say that actually, if we were to classify the Arab countries on a scale of oppression and conditions requiring revolt, the Syrian regime would definitely rank among the top countries in that regard, in the sense that not only you had there the social economic problems that were at the roots of explosions in countries like Tunisia or Egypt, and you had them at a higher degree than, for instance, Tunisia, in the sense that there was quite a terrible situation in the Syrian countryside, which was aggravated by drought over the 2 years before the uprising, but the social conditions of that were a product of the neoliberal policies of the Assad regime over the last 20 years, in the 90s, and after the turn of the century, accelerated under the son, when he inherited power from his father in the year 2000. You had deindustrialization with this neoliberal reform and the reduction of state investment, rising unemployment, terrible inflation, and very high pressure on the cost of living. For people familiar with Syria like myself, what you would usually hear from people, from Syrians, before 2011 was protest or complaints rather about the cost of living and all that. So it was a very difficult condition socially, and in the framework of a regime compared to which Mubarak's Egypt was definitely most liberal and most democratic country. And I'm not kidding here or exaggerating, but there is a huge difference between political conditions in Mubarak's Egypt, where the opposition could organize, where you had even a huge organization which was one foot in the opposition, one foot collaborating with the regime, which was the Muslim Brotherhood, and you had left-wing opposition, you had Nasserist opposition. They could organize all sorts of protests, demonstrations, sit-ins, and all that. All this was completely out of the question in a country like Syria. No one would dare do that, otherwise you would find yourself in jail for as many years as the regime would wish. I know personally a number of friends who have been in jail. Friends who were members of the Marxist tradition of opposition in Syria, and many, I know many actually, who spent between 15, 17, 18 years of their life in jail. That is, you enter jail at the age of 30, you leave jail, you're close to 50. You've spent, what someone like me at my age would regard as the best years in jail. That's absolutely terrible. So that's the kind of regime you had, and you had an uprising against that. And actually, this was a country in which no political opposition had been able to really organize for a very long period. And this contributed to the fact that it was actually also one of the most democratic uprisings, in the sense that you had networks of young people mainly using the social media. That helps in our times in overcoming the weaknesses of organization. In organizing this big revolt, which was absolutely remarkable and I should say heroic in its. I remember, for instance, 2011. When I went to Egypt, the Egyptians were completely admirative of the Syrians, saying that if we had faced in Egypt a repression like this one, like the one they were having in Syria, the movement would have stopped long ago. We're not sure it would have continued, because the regime was killing people in the first dozens and then hundreds, and and it kept escalating the repression over the days and weeks in that year. So the militarization of the intifada, the intifada, the uprising, intifada in Arabic, in Syria, is first and above all the result of the regime's repression. And people who are very smart and say they made a big mistake in taking arms, such great advices from outside are of no use or value. One should say how you react if you have to be facing demonstrations in which you see the people being killed in increasing numbers, and a regime which, as now everybody can see, would not hesitate to kill whatever number to survive, to stick to power. And therefore, It's even reached a situation where I remember one of the prominent oppositionists in Syria who told me, I remember it was in October 2011, we reached a point where we are afraid of stopping. Which means what? Which means that with a regime like that, you can't surrender. If you surrender, you're dead. You're finished, or you torture and all that. When I tell you 15, 17 years in jail, that involves years of torture. Not the 15 years, because after that time, it's no use to torture you, but a few years of torture, of terrible torture. So anyway, now, you had a convergence in Syria between the regime and the regional counter-revolution, or the regional counter-revolutions, one could say, because I was thinking of the Gulf countries, which are the linchpin of reaction and counter-revolution in the region. But this applies also to the Iranian regime, which is also a counter-revolutionary regime in its own fashion. But you had a convergence of the regime and its backers. But here, what I'm pointing to is the regime and the Gulf countries. A convergence in droning the Syrian uprising in Islamic fundamentalism. The regime from day one started saying these are jihadists, takfiri, and all that, on the one hand to frighten the minorities in Syria, the religious minorities, to frighten also the Sunnis who are the secular Sunnis, or those who don't like Islamic fundamentalism. And the regime did everything it could to turn that into a self-fulfilling prophecy, not least by releasing from jail in the summer of 2011 the jihadists that were kept in Syrian jails. And who we saw later on at the head of some of the jihadi groups that will proliferate in the years to come. I said convergence with the Gulf. The Gulf countries also had an objective interest in turning the Syrian uprising from a democratic, secular one, as it was in the beginning, into one dominated by Islamic fundamentalist forces, because the democratic revolution in Syria is a threat to everybody. It's a threat as much to the Syrian regime than to the monarchies of the Gulf, or Jordan, or whatever. And whereas a sectarian battle against Alawites, or Nusayriyin, as the Wahhabis would put it, is something that fits perfectly in their ideological perspective. So you had this convergence between the regime favoring the dominance of its, what I call its preferred enemies, and the Gulf countries favoring the development of their preferred friends. And it happened that the preferred enemy of the regime is the preferred friend of the Gulf countries. Anyway, so that's in very few words the tragedy of the Syrian revolution. And yet, for a while, the main impetus and all that was in continuity with the uprising, and at least in the year 2012, the dominant force, even in the armed struggle against the regime, were still representative in some way of the initial uprising before the other groups started developing at their cost and expense. Now, this situation led in 2013 to, despite the fact that the regime had a huge military superiority and firepower, and most of which consist in having the monopoly of air force. Of course, no one has air means in Syria except the regime and its allies. Despite that, in 2013, the regime was losing ground and threatened with defeat. And that's when Iran intervened massively to rescue the regime. Iran, through its proxies in the region, Hezbollah from Lebanon, Shia militias from Iraq, Afghani refugees in Iran forced to go fight in Syria, etc. And this allowed the regime to redress the military balance, go on the offensive again, and yet 2 years after that, despite this massive intervention, the regime again was on the defensive and losing ground. And this time Russia intervened, September 2015, and intervened very massively. And now the Russian aviation, under the pretext, which also gave way to some great statements by Kerry welcoming the Russian intervention because it's going to fight ISIS. Either he's naive or he's completely stupid. What was obvious was happened. I mean, that was most essentially an intervention on the side of the regime. The overwhelming part of the bombing is not about ISIS, it's about the Syrian opposition, the non-ISIS Syrian opposition, which clashed with ISIS much more than the regime clashed with ISIS, by the way, because ISIS not only had been de facto favored by the regime and had even some dealing and wheeling with the regime, but there hardly has been until 2014-15 any direct clashes between the regime and ISIS. So, why is peace not at hand in Syria? For the simple reason that for a regime like this to accept the concessions, the minimal concessions without which there can be no compromise or no peace, assuming that what we want is compromise and peace, not even discussing the victory of the revolutionary side, I'm just discussing in terms of peace, okay? A regime like this will not do the concessions, will not therefore go really for peace unless it feels threatened to a degree with which it has no other choice, okay? That is, unless it feels compelled to accept these concessions, if we want. And the most prominent of that is for Assad to step down, because it's obvious that after such a terrible war, after 500,000 or more people killed, after half the population displaced or turned into refugees, and we're speaking here of 10 million people in this condition, half of them refugees outside the country, that is 5 million people. After all that, and the country destroyed, the cities turned into rubble and all that, there is no way anyone, would accept a peace whereby this guy would still be the ruler of the country. And as long as Assad has Iranian and Russian support, it's to a point where he believes that he can win, as he is more and more now, is multiplying statements about the fact that he's going to reconquer the whole country. There's no way for him to compromise, and therefore no way for peace. Now, the key problem here has been that the United States, from the beginning, the Obama administration, I should say, because there were disagreements about that at the top of the US establishment. Obama did, for the United States as a whole, the establishment, there was a red line which was the regime should not fall. And contrary to those who have a difficulty to understanding that we are no longer at the time of the occupation of Iraq and we are no longer under George W. Bush, the motto in Washington is not regime change. It's actually about Syria regime conservation. And that Assad should step down, but the regime should be maintained. Otherwise, that would be a danger for the stability of the whole region. Now, on this, they all agree. But then they had disagreements, with part saying, okay, but we need to give the opposition the means to counterbalance Assad to a point where we would have the conditions for a compromise, a la Yemen, because Obama had said in 2012, for us in Syria, it should be the Yemen solution. That is, the president stepped down. Of course, he wouldn't say the Yemen solution today. The president steps down, but keeps, the key strings in his hands, and you have a kind of coalition between the opposition and the old regime. So you had one opinion saying that, and the other, the one that prevails, Obama's opinion, was refusing to give the Syrian opposition any significant support, and especially military support. De facto, letting the Gulf countries and Turkey do that, while knowing perfectly what kind of forces these guys would fund and arm, and vetoing everybody when it comes to the most crucial defensive weapon that the Syrian uprising needed, and that is anti-aircraft weapons. Have you ever heard of planes shot down by the Syrian opposition? Have you even heard of helicopters? Easy target, but a great deal of the bombing is barrel bombs thrown from helicopters. It's very barbaric, extremely killing without any discrimination, but from helicopters, easy targets if you have minimal anti-aircraft weapons. But even with that, there are being very few cases because the Syrian opposition doesn't have these weapons. And that's not only because Washington refuses to deliver them, but also because Washington prevents its regional allies from delivering these weapons. One example, Turkey produces Stinger missiles, anti-aircraft, manpads, under American license, and has a veto from Washington. You don't deliver a single piece of this to Syria. Period. That's how it functions. So that's why the peace is now not at hand. Now, one reason why they are stepping up Russia, Iran, and the Syrian regime, which is completely dominated by Iran nowadays, by the way, the secular regime of the smiling Bashar al-Assad and his smiling spouse are actually in the hands of the mullahs of Tehran. But the reason why they are escalating now this war, as you can see, with the encirclement of the eastern part of Aleppo and the very vicious bombing of that eastern part, is because they are trying to make the most on the ground before the presidential election in the United States. Because they know that Obama will leave the scene. Most probably it will be Hillary Clinton. And she is known to have been on the other side in the discussion in Washington about Syria. And therefore, well, with an administration which would be more willing to do something about Syria, they want to create facts on the ground whereby they could say, look, it's done, and no use to try to do anything else. So that's where it stands, and that's the answer to the question. And with Fred eager for me to stop, I'll stop here.